Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be talking about how anti-China rhetoric is off the charts in Western media and how they are manufacturing consent for a war with China. And so this is an article from thediplomat.com. And so to start off with, we're going to talk about a key feature of mainstream Western media today is the relentless China bashing. It is off the charts and tiring, often involving regurgitated trivia or fabricated stories with no evidence to support callous statements about the country, demonstrating a deep lack of understanding, but such stories continue to be churned out with no end in sight. Okay, so skip ahead a little bit. There's a positive story in China any day of the week in any of the leading. It's hard to find any positive stories on China in any of the leading global media outlets, apart from reports in January about the Lunar New Year. There will hardly be any, and these are too likely to have a negative spin. Okay, so there's reports circulating around media groups in the West that it has to be negative towards China. So typically the negative stories adhere to three core ideas, so this is important information, which inform the unspoken guidelines within these press rooms when it comes to reporting on China. First is the belief that China is a threat to the world and that this belief must be relentlessly reinforced at every opportunity. So they're manufacturing that consent for war. How and why China is a threat is never explored. Okay, so that's the funny thing where it's kind of like with Iran, where why did China build its country so close to so many American bases? That's really the type of propaganda that's being pushed right now, which China has no invasionary plans. It rarely ever goes to war. America is nearly constantly in war. I think it's 16 years out of its entire history that's not been at war. So just ridiculous to see China as the aggressive one here. So the article goes on to say how and why China is a threat is never explored, such as the deep-rooted and almost religious nature of this belief. Sound arguments do not matter. The basic tenets of good journalism are ignored when it comes to China's story. Left ignored is the plentiful evidence that shows China is not a global threat, even if one can point to mistakes and overreach in certain areas. China has not invaded any country in decades or imposed sanctions that have devastated the lives of millions in poor countries, unlike the West, led by the United States. Yes, it's the old saying, make sure to take the log out of your own eye before taking the what is it? The pin out of someone else's eye. I can't. Oh no, I knew that saying. The log versus the thorn. I guess it's the thorn. I can't remember. Second is that China must be linked to every possible global event that affects us. Oh, I saw this recently where China was taking a neutral stance, looking out for the humanitarian, looking to stop the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And Western articles said, look at how China's trying to take advantage of this by caring about people's lives. It's just ridiculous how they make everything into an anti-China article. So the article goes on to say this provides an opportunity for the West to bash China while simultaneously burnishing its own credentials as a supposed arbiter of what is right and wrong in international relations, which isn't working. Countries don't even want to talk to the United States when it comes to figuring out the Palestinian situation. From the pandemic to the Russia-Ukraine war to carbon emissions, from rising sea levels to the scramble for rare earth materials, from the building of infrastructure in Africa to the production of vaccines, there must be an angle to demonize the country and instill fear in Western nations. So again, that's that manufacturing consent for war against China. Indeed, media outlets are reverting to the yellow peril of the late 1800s. So the China's century of humiliation, where they were exploited and colonized by the Western world. There is no subtle and nuanced approach to instilling fear like this. It is full on and very often blatantly racist, but it is now acceptable for one to be racist about Chinese in Western media, despite the fact that black-white relations are very carefully described. Third part of this phenomenon that they're talking about in this article, which is surprisingly not challenged by liberal readers of mainstream media, is the sentiment that everything must be done, even illegal and unfair methods, to arrest the rise of China, never mind the rights of hundreds of millions of Chinese to have a better life after a century of poverty and deprivation. So yeah, that's constantly going on, where the United States has to do everything possible to make sure China is not a successful country. And so this really gets into some of the things that I love to talk about, which is people like to mock young people for saying, communism has never worked because it's never been tried before. Well, guess what? Communism, this iteration of communism with Chinese characteristics, is absolutely working in China. And if you compare it to another similar country such as India, which is a Western style democracy, that's definitely not working. So if you're comparing, say, a capitalistic country, a democratic country like the United States to, say, a communistic country like Cuba, sure, I could see how that comparison, as unfair as it is, would show the United States in a better light. But when you compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges, such as, say, a China versus an India, you can clearly see that at least the Chinese form of communism does seem to work. So going back to the article, headline after headline captures the sentiment, which is normalized view that there is a need to curb the rise of China, and this is a legitimate geopolitical objective. It is definitely not a legitimate objective, I don't think. There's no explanation about why or if it is even morally acceptable. It has become a feature of Western commentary on China to say that its rise is a concern and a threat. Okay, so this is that Overton window I talk about a lot, which is the only areas you're allowed to talk about is China is a threat. How do we solve it? It's not about whether China is a threat or not. You're not allowed to talk about that. That's outside the Overton window. What is the Overton window is China is a threat. Let's figure out how do we solve it. So do we solve it through economic means? Do we solve it through military means, diplomatic means, et cetera, et cetera? But the thing is, they make sure that you're looking at the problem only through the lens of what they want you to see. You can't look out and say, hey, wait a minute, is China even a problem or not? Because that's not within the conversation. That's not within the Overton window. That's not talked about in any media and entertainment in the Western world. So the Western world does not really understand how propagandized it truly is. And I say this all the time, where places like Russia, China, when they have state-owned media and entertainment, it's explicitly state-owned, okay? In the West, everything is state-owned media and entertainment, but it's not explicitly state-owned media and entertainment. So people are like, oh, those Chinese, those Russians, they're propagandized. But they make sure everything is clearly, this is what the Chinese government, this is what the Russian government thinks. In the West, people feel like they have freedom of press, but they don't. They really don't. Everything is controlled by 6 media and entertainment corporations in the West, and those are controlled by a small group of people that also control the American government. That is the banking cartels, the oligarchs, the mega corporations that control the West. And there's no non-state media within the mainstream media of the West. Okay, so the article goes on to say there's a school of thought in the United States that it was America that magnanimously allowed China its first baby steps into the globalized economy, and that in hindsight, the U.S. was too nice to China. This view betrays everything that is imperial about the West and why it is unable to come to terms with the legitimate rights of other nations to grow and become powers in their own right. So the United States needed China to fight against Russia. And I think if you ask Russians and Chinese today, they regret that schism between the two formerly communist countries. China is still considered communist, but they are a different type of communist, I would say, than they were back during the time of the Cold War. And so these two countries deeply regret that split, and they allowed the United States to split them and pit them against each other when they really needed to be working together because it was in their own national interest to be working with each other. One, a major resource powerhouse, and the other, a major manufacturing powerhouse. Although you could even say that back then, Russia was more of a major manufacturing powerhouse too, and China was just developing into the major manufacturing powerhouse that it is today. But still, those two countries made very complementary economies, and the United States was very successful diplomatically pitting them against each other, but they understand never to do that again. Absolutely never. Russia and China will not be against each other in the foreseeable future whatsoever. So the article goes on to say, indeed, Western media seems wholly tied to the hegemonic competition view of geopolitics, constantly referencing the Thucydides trap, I don't know how to pronounce that word, it's Greek, and being stuck in the Western canon as if there are no other ways of looking at geopolitics in the world. This view assumes that conflict is inevitable and helps demonize China while justifying the hegemonic position of the West and the United States in particular as a globally stabilizing force. How stabilizing is the United States given the Ukraine crisis, given the Middle East crisis, given the coups in Africa? Just so often, the United States makes things far worse than it does make it better. Okay, so the article goes on. So how do we fix the current situation? First, people in China and non-Western world must realize that when it comes to the workings of the mainstream media, we're in a new era, a propaganda war the likes of which the world has never seen before, powered by today's digital technology. The media war is real and tech-driven, and it is not a fight for eyeballs to deliver fair, honest, and educational news. It is almost everything else but that, especially when it comes to China or the enemies of the West. So this is really encapsulates one of the reasons I got into this, which is providing content for a non-mainstream media audience. And that's that I really feel like you should understand what's going on in the world. And a lot of people seem very confused, like, why are things happening the way they are? And if you have the correct model of the world, which I feel like I have, these things make complete sense. I predicted these things 13-ish years ago. Like, what's happening now, sure, I didn't predict how fast it would happen, but the actual events that are happening, largely I predicted. And so I just think that if you have the right model, when you enter data, you will get the correct predictions. And right now, people in the West don't have the correct model because media and entertainment is blatantly outright lying to you. It's not just lies of omission where they tell you certain things and don't tell you other things. It's lies of commission. They're just outright directly telling you things that are falsehoods. And I'm willing to sacrifice a very large income in order to provide the truth for you. So you're welcome. So moving on in the article, on one side is sheer propaganda aimed at the preservation of the Western powers. Participants include the most well-known brands in the Western media world, which are household names across the world. The idea that Western media is run by fair-minded people who are independent, driven only by a desire to talk truth to power is a mirage, is a myth, and is a bitter pill that needs to be swallowed. The idea that Western journalists is a paragon of virtue also needs to be banished from the minds of consumers of media. So Western media will always support the domestic and foreign policy of the American government, of the oligarchs in charge of America. And you're seeing that nonstop. Look at the genocide going on in Palestine right now. Like, they are nonstop, deep-throatedly supporting Israel, despite Israel coming out and saying the most genocidal rhetoric ever about flattening Gaza, saying the Palestinian people aren't human. I mean, talking about nuking Gaza, like, just ridiculously genocidal rhetoric. And the entirety of the mainstream media is supporting that, both right and left. If you're watching MSNBC or Fox News or CNN, they're all supporting Israel right now. And so that should tell you something. That should tell you they're not fair, free, and balanced. Okay, so the article goes on to say that is the first stage in enabling one to step out of the propaganda mist we are engulfed in on a daily basis so that one can examine different viewpoints as news is consumed. This is not easy given the current dominance of Western media outlets and their apparent collective mission. The next step is to dismantle the dominance of Western media. So again, this is where we're at right now with the rise of alternative media. People like myself, people like the Duran, people like Brian Berletic and Angelo Giuliano, people like Carl Zah, people like Scott Ritter, just everyone you could think of, Gonzalo Lira, who needs to be freed. All of these people are speaking truth to power, and they're providing an alternative to the propaganda that the West is spewing out. Okay, so it goes on to say this too will be a long, hard fight. Mainstream media are the most powerful in the world, and for close to a century, Western media have had a stranglehold on the dissemination of information on international news and viewpoints across the world. Many had their origins in colonialism. That's completely correct. Okay, so across the world, there's an opportunity to contribute to this effort, not necessarily by building large media companies, but by investing in media companies that are committed to fair and objective analysis so that local audiences, in the first instance, have choices and are not inundated by the propaganda of mainstream Western media. This, too, will not be an easy task, and there are many hurdles to overcome, but this is not the space to dive into those details. Ultimately, it is all about readers becoming more aware of global issues by having more non-Western sources to rely on so they're not victims of the current propaganda war. This is beginning to happen as more alternatives flourish. It is an urgent need in the West so that the mass hysteria generated by mainstream media is prevented from creating fear and pitting Western societies against the rest of the world. Today, the target is China, tomorrow India, and then maybe Africa. Okay, so this is our call to action here. We, as people who, if you're watching this, we have a correct model, or you're trying to get a correct model for how the world works. What is our paradigm? What is our worldview? What is the lens which we view information? What is the model where we put the data in? we have to disseminate that to the rest of the world. And so I encourage you as much as possible to tell people about this channel, tell people about how we have a very correct, very accurate model for how things are going. When it came to the COVID pandemic, when it came to election fraud, when it came to what's going on with Russia, China, what's going on in the Middle East, we understand why these things are happening, and people with Western models, propagandized models, really don't understand this situation and don't understand what the potential outcomes are, or what the likely outcomes are. So I encourage you, tell people about this channel, tell people about the Duran, tell people about Brian Berletic's channel, New Atlas, tell people about Carl Zah's channel, et cetera, because we are providing you legitimate information that can help you understand the world around you and the potential dire consequences if we don't right this ship for civilization, for humanity as a whole. So anyways, if you found this video to be helpful, informative, anything like that, please give us a thumbs up. It helps us in the algorithm. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble for more content. Leave us a comment in the comment box below. We read all of the questions, concerns, critiques. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.